I'm sorry, it's already 5 minutes past, so we should start again. So because of time constraint, I'm gonna use this paper in case you can really track your time. So next, we have Joseph Bush here, who is the founder and principal consultant of taxonomy strategies. His research is focused on metadata, taxonomy, semantic technologies, indexing, and classification. And he is a past president of the Association of Information Science and Technology, and also a past member of the DCMI Executive Committee. Today, he's going to present entitled African Development Bank Sankofa Program. Please welcome Joseph here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, very much appreciated. Apologies for the confusing order of presentations today. We're busy running, no, it's not anybody's fault. We're running a workshop upstairs, and I wasn't able to come in the regular order in the program. Yeah, so I've been working over the past year in a little bit of an unusual environment. Normally, my projects are fairly short, and we go and we do some work, and we go away, and it's the organizations take over the projects. I'm working on a project which is a full-time one-year project initially for the African Development Bank, which is located in Abidjan in the Côte d'Ivoire. The African Development Bank is a multilateral financial institution. The members contribute to the fund, or the trust fund, which is then used to finance development projects in Africa. So the members are most of the African countries, of which there are 54, as well as many other countries, mostly developed countries. South Korea is including South Korea, United States, Canada, UK, France, most of the European countries. So it's a fairly standard approach to development financing. And there are other regional development banks, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. So it's a fairly common practice. But you need to know a little bit about the environment to understand the nature of what we're trying to do. So the way development banks work is they fund projects. And the way that they fund projects is by following a standard operating procedure that's very formal, including the formation of the program, the due diligence associated with it, the identification of the funding, and then the monitoring of the funding of the project, and then the completion of the project, including identifying lessons learned. So it's a very it follows a fairly standard project development life cycle, but the projects are quite diverse, and they're generally associated with what we call these days sustainable development projects, and follow the UN's sustainable development taxonomy. The African Development Bank actually has focused on 5 particular sustainable development goals, and most of the projects focus on them. And it's very interesting because all of the projects that get developed need to follow these sustainable development goals. So, for example, in terms of green energy, in terms of gender equality, in terms of upskilling of the young population, and so on. So it's a very interesting and dynamic environment. So the purpose of the project we're working on relates to documentation associated with the project development lifecycle, as well as other documentation, but we'll focus primarily on the idea that we're trying to facilitate these development projects. So one of the barriers turns out to be the ability to generate all of the documentation that's needed and to provide for the management of that documentation, including its accessibility, its transparency, and its management through the life cycle. So traditionally, we're concerned about the management of these documents as records, but in this case, we're also concerned about the management of these documents in terms of making them transparent so that the decision-making process associated with these funding activities is properly documented and that there's full disclosure. And similarly, when you're doing certain kinds of activities, that they're protected from disclosure if that's appropriate. So there's this kind of publication and this, as well as this records management component, which is very interesting. There are also objectives that are traditional knowledge management objectives in terms of what we call breaking down silos. So there's a lot of collaboration across departments when you do this kind of work. And because depending upon the nature of a particular project, for example, there are cultural heritage projects that get funded, and those have certain kinds of collaboration associated with them that are very different than if you're building a port or a road or railroad or you're developing some other sort of program. The other challenge is to capture these documents in a complete and consistent way and generally make them accessible. So the project is to build the infrastructure to do this, to create the standards framework, the processes, and to get them in place in the organization. So many goals and many complicated goals. So just a sort of a summary of what I've already said is just those which are related to metadata. So in order to facilitate these development activities, actually requires the classification of documents with the correct projects, identifying the types of documents they are, and providing other types of information. For example, what the particular project is, just from a registry of projects. And there's metadata then associated with many of these kind of standard types of entities. The project phase itself, the record type, and the project are entities which have certain metadata associated with them, which can be inherited if you correctly identify them. And then, as I said, being able to support and enable the retention and disposition of the records, they need to be classified correctly in terms of what their business function is and what the type of record it is. And those have then associated with them metadata values that identify the importance of those documents for record retention perspective. And from a disclosure perspective, the documents have disclosure and access metadata associated with them that identifies whether it needs to be disclosed or whether it needs to not be disclosed and the reason for that. So just a little bit more about the development process. What's interesting to me about the development process in this particular institution is it's very formal. It's what we call standard operating procedures, and what's associated with the key phases of these development life cycles are key documents. Think of them as a report, a summary report that basically is related to the approval of the project, or a summary report that identifies all of the preparation that's been done in association with it. The programming is your sort of standard strategy documents for the program area, and then completion documents are things like final reports. Some of these come out as final items and others come out as interim items, since many of these projects run for a period of time. But it's very document centric, and many of these documents are very formulaic and have templates associated with them, or should have templates associated with them in some cases. So what I wanted to talk then a little bit, slightly more detail about what we mean by business classification. And this is, for those who are have a records management focus, this should be fairly typical, but just to give you a flavor for it, one of the things we're doing is designing this business classification scheme. The higher up you are in this scheme, the broader you are, the more standardized and simple it is. So for example, there are 10 functions that represent the key areas of activity in a large institution, in this case, a multilateral financial institution. At the activity level, there are 68 activities currently identified. Those are what we would call business activities. And then for the project-oriented documents, there are 6 phases. And then within the records, there's hundreds of record types. Now, one of the challenges is how you control those record types and harmonize them so that you don't have duplication at the same time that you provide distinctions between the way in which certain types of documents function in different areas of the organization. So correspondence is correspondence, but it may be different depending upon what the context is. So it's the typical kinds of contextual problems that we tend to have when we talk about classification. So just very quickly to go through that. So here are the 10 functional areas, and you can look at the slides and see these in more detail if you're interested. This is an example of some of the activities that are associated with a particular function. The phases are fairly straightforward and represent that set of project phases I mentioned, and then when you get down to the record level, you get to a fairly detailed level. These are sometimes referred to as document types, sometimes as records. Just to illustrate, what I'm showing you are some screenshots of the system that we're building to enable this within the organization, and it's not very sexy. So what is important is that we're bringing together 2 independent systems, one that does document management, which manages the process of creating the documents, and one which manages the records, holds the records management, typically referred to as a repository. The difference between these systems is the front-end system is used for collaboration, the creation of the document through its, until it's approved and finalized, as opposed to the repository, where the documents are not any longer able, should not be able to be edited and need to be then run through a process that triggers either a record retention event or a disclosure event. So on the front end side, when you build a record, one of the challenges is how do we capture metadata? This is one of the great problems in an operating environment. This is not about publishing. This is about business documents that you create in your daily life. How many people actually put metadata on their Word documents or on their spreadsheet documents or on their PowerPoints? Some of us do, but most of us don't. So it's the same thing in this institutional setting. Even when you create some of these reports and documents, you have the same challenge. How do we do that? How do we enforce that? So one of the mechanisms is by having these key access points like project codes, which have metadata, more detailed metadata associated with them that can be pulled over from other database applications. So when the document, in order for the document to be able to be saved and used within the collaboration environment, you need to fill in some of these fields. This is just a quick summary of the key retention and disclosure classifications. They're very simple. There are only 4 business values that range from transitory to what we call vital, and they have a certain retention associated with them. Transitory would be things like emails that don't have any other particular function, and the idea is that they get disposed of within a very short period of time. On the other end of the extreme, you have vital documents, and those are things that might be like a charter or a set of bylaws or rules and regulations, and those are kept typically forever. On the disclosure side, it's relatively simple. It's either something that's to be public or something that's to be restricted. And then within restricted, there are those documents which are labeled confidential. That means they're currently confidential and might in the future be able to be disclosed, as opposed to strictly confidential, which would be documents that would never be disclosed. So again, fairly simple, but very profound. In other organizations I've worked with, these get way more complicated. So it's fairly simple and actually very helpful that it's that's not too complex. This slide is mostly just trying to give you a sense of there is then a very simple workflow or process for record retention and disposition. When you have the metadata associated with it, when the documents become records and then are kind of locked, typically just as PDF files, basically triggers it's a publication event. Then there's a process of calculating the period for which the record is to be retained. The system keeps track of that, and when that period expires, it automatically triggers what's called disposal event, which can either be an automatic disposal, but more typically, it triggers a workflow which asks the appropriate business owner or steward to make a decision about whether the item should be retained further and should reset the period, or whether the disposal event would happen. And often a disposal event may mean transfer to archives. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a destruction event, but in some cases, it's about removing information because it no longer provides any useful or archival function. There's a similar workflow around disclosure and access, which has to do more with enabling and complying with the requirements to publish these items. This is actually a forward-looking activity right now. People are notified that they have documents that need to be published, but there's no automatic mechanism for doing that. And by publishing, in this case, we're talking about making it an item which is available via the website. And I should say that in itself doesn't create access. It just creates, it creates the ability to find it if you can find it. There's not a very good process in place currently that provides for the true accessibility or findability of those documents. The way this is happening in the organization is in an iterative fashion. There's a general master plan that was produced by dealing with regional offices which have all business functions. But presently we're working through various departments. There's 100 units, business units in the bank. We are doing them kind of one by one, working with each unit to develop the activities and records that are associated with those units. And as we approve those, they then become incorporated into the master plan. So it's kind of an iterative process. So that's one best practice to do rather than trying to create a master plan and get everyone to adopt it. It does mean that things are a little bit messy and we need to sometimes do harmonization after the fact. So we have an approved plan, we have a new plan. There are some things which need to be harmonized. Sometimes the existing plan may need to be changed to accommodate what's actually a better idea on how we want to label and describe a particular type of record. The other thing that we're doing, again, this is a fairly simple thing, but nobody's talked about it that much explicitly, is having guidelines for how we create these labels and what constitutes a proper activity or a proper record name. So creating simple high-level guidelines that can be applied by the business owners for labeling purposes, and having those established as standard operating procedures is something that we're trying to do. Presently, it's a little bit messy, and we heard Antoine Isaac talk about this in the Europeana case, and it's no different if you're dealing with these types of documents. If you don't have guidelines, then you have to have a lot of cleanup. It's a lot better to try to have some guidelines and try to minimize the cleanup later on. It also improves it helps eliminate the redundant categories, facilitates merging, and improves the label predictability. I want to just talk very briefly about the metadata. There's quite a lot of metadata, and this is hard to read in the back of the room, but the general idea is there's a lot of this. Nobody's going to type all of this in, but when a lot of this is available and generated when a project is established, or when in the case of projects, there are other types of standard types of sets of metadata that get built in enterprise systems, but not in the documents. It can either the idea here is to basically inherit all of that metadata The current practice is to copy it into the document record. In other words, rather than look it up each time you need it, look it up once and publish it as part of the document's metadata. So there's quite a lot of this that gets inherited. The amount that has to be created is fairly simple. The basic descriptive information associated with the document, things like what the title of it is, and verifying what the date of it is. And then many of the other fields of metadata are automatically set either by inheriting from one of the enterprise systems, if you will, like an authority file, or as a result of attaining a certain phase in a business process. So it's fine and good to create metadata, but if you don't use it, that's another problem. So the other part of the system, the Sankofa system, is providing a pretty sophisticated browsing environment that, in fact, it tends to focus more on browsing than searching. So the idea is that you want to see groups of documents. Often you want to see groups of documents that are related to you, that you've been involved in approving or moving through part of that process. So you want to see what your portfolio is, or in case related to a particular project. So there are fairly standard types of filters, things like countries, sectors, project names, content types, and other types of things. Some of these are customized for different departments that have different types of functional capabilities, but it is the important idea here is the idea of using the metadata as a filter for documents. Hasn't been talked about that much. I think we think about findability as generally being more generally associated with traditional search. The idea here is that findability is more navigating through a collection of documents based on a set of filters. I mentioned this before, that there's this is an important issue. I've seen this in other projects, that there's a tendency to try to build one system to do both document and records management, and that does not work. Records management is completely different from document management, and the typical fatal error in the failure of organizations to be able to manage their institutional documents is that confusion. Again, this applies to operating environments. It's really a bit different when we're talking about institutional repositories. If you will, institutional repositories are the second sort. It's really a records management kind of environment, or it could be an archive. We often call archives and records management environments. But basically, the idea is that those documents are not, the content's not changing. Metadata could change, of course. Content's not changing, whereas the document management system is more where the content's being created in the first place. And keeping those separate is really important and key. So in summary, the goal is the same. How do we get complete and consistent metadata? So one is having, kind of core standards where we have required and optional fields, having these editorial guidelines and naming conventions for the controlled vocabularies, reusing the metadata in bank applications and repositories, and then all of those are should, and we hope result in reduced errors in terms of creating the metadata, enabling reliable search results by having good, clean metadata, and optimizing the staff efforts in doing that. So I'm supposed to also say that this is wishful thinking to some extent. We're still in the early days of this. We have some early proof of concepts, and we have about 6 or 7 units that have been onboarded. But the general idea here was to kind of give you tell you a bit about what we're trying to do. This is a long-term project. It's not going to be done overnight, but it could hopefully, we hope, profoundly change and enable and support the key missions of the African Development Bank. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Joseph Woods. So Joseph introduced the case of the metadata strategy for African Bank, which was Sankofa. Sankofa.
Yeah, it means looking backwards.
Okay.
While you're looking forwards, it's sort of one of those, kind of great images. So.
And I'm sure, I was looking at the website of taxonomy strategies, and I'm sure there were lots of projects you have worked on. And are there any, based on the project experience for the applicant bank, and what distinguishes, this case, from other projects you have worked on?
That's a great, that's a good question. It's very profound. So one of the things that really strikes me about working with the African Development Bank is that I've tended to work in more in developed country environments. And one of the things about Africa is that there's enormous need on the one hand, but there's also enormous opportunity. Every project can make a really enormous difference. The other thing is that most of I find the African Development Bank, for a variety of reasons, has a much more instrumental relationship with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So when they fund a project and that project has a green energy component to it, it's usually much more impactful than if you're doing a similar project in a more developed country, partly because the bar is relatively low, so the impact is very, very high. And the other thing is that the projects are generally smaller in terms of the amount that's being spent, and that means that there are more projects. So you have this, and this is why documentation is so important, and the ability to do that in an efficient and effective way, because they're trying to do more projects than you would be typically doing in other similar institutional settings that I've worked in, for example, in North America or Europe or Asia. So those are a couple of the observations. They're trying to do more with less, but they also have a bigger impact generally with those projects. And that documentation becomes, and I actually heard this in one of their funder conferences, when they asked people for what would really make a difference. One of the things people have said is that the ability to do that documentation faster and more efficiently was a critical factor in being able to do more with less. And I took that. I was very surprised and encouraged and challenged by hearing that.
Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, from the floor. Yeah.
Thank you, Joseph. This is very kind of simple and quick questions. When you say leader retention, so I mean, in terms of in archival sciences, retention is quite an important part of managing the record, right? So you just mentioned that there are 5 categories, 4, 5. I can remember. Okay,
There's only 4.
right? Okay. So with what respect you decide those kind of that is one. And the second question is something like what kind of sensitive data, probably when you say in the bank, there are lots of personal data, information, how you are going to give those kind of data. That is the second question.
Yeah, those are great questions. So it really kind of gets to the heart of the records management and the access part of this. And these are very standard considerations. So first of all, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not a records management expert, but I'm working with the archives and records managers in the bank, and we're working in the secretariat where records management and disclosure and access to information policies are where the responsibility center is for that. So I don't want to, without getting too complicated. In addition to what I've shown, I very quickly went by. There is a formal record series that is generated based on the business classification that we're working with. And there's a direct relationship between the two of them. I mentioned before, at a very general level, the record schedule operates at the activity level. So there are 68 categories right now, but there are exceptions, meaning in this case that typically, rather than there just being one record series in that activity, there may be more if there are different types of records that happen to be grouped there. So it's a little bit messy, and we're still working on that. And it's a little bit about right hand, left hand kind of problem. The challenge, honestly, is more about the transitory records. And this is a very common problem in organizations where things like email is not processed so that you can identify what's junk or not really worth keeping and should really be removed as a hygiene matter for a variety of reasons, especially in financial institutions, even if they're non-governmental organizations like this. As opposed to the problems, in my opinion, are more that they keep their materials for a very long time. So long, honestly, that I some days I said, well, I'm even worrying about this. I will be dead before anything gets disposed of. And almost everybody could say that. I'm older than many of the people, but even the people who are much younger than me. So many things have very long retention periods. So there's generally not a culture in which I've talked about this with others at this meeting, where prioritization is easily done. And in this case, prioritization about what is important records to be kept for the long term, for all the reasons we keep things for a long time, the legal reasons, the cultural and history reasons, and so on. So that is very much an issue, and I'm not really addressing that, but I'm recognizing it. And in my work at the bank as an outside advisor, I can raise those issues as I do, but I can't resolve it. So that was one thing. The other one was about what we might call security for sensitive information. And you're absolutely right. There's the easy case is personal identifying information, and it's easy in the sense that anything which is personal identifying information, it needs to be confidential. And generally, it's strictly confidential, meaning that except if there's a legal requirement that it be disclosed, would you disclose it? So in that case, the job is to be sure it's secure. It turns out in a financial institution that there needs to be a lot of collaboration across departments because you have lots of different people involved in doing due diligence. So there's actually a requirement that we provide security at a very granular level, much more so than the developers would like. Meaning often it's down to the individual and the individual role, and it's very labor intensive from a technical perspective to do that, no matter what environment you're in. So that's a challenge, but that is part of the requirements that there be security. And I'd only add to that there is this additional level of security that exists, which has to do more with not just the easy part of personal identifying information, but there are very because this is what's called sovereign banking, meaning that it's you're dealing with governments, and governments are often very sensitive about what should or should not be disclosed. And there are definitely public interest questions about whether that's a correct position to be in. There's a lot of politics involved. However, generally speaking, sovereign banking information is very restricted, and there are clear memoranda of understanding, so legal agreements about what can and can't be disclosed. So we have to honor those, so it requires that. There's also then a lot of public-private partnerships, and those have their own set of issues. So mainly, I think the answer to your question is it's very complex, and it needs to be, there are very complex requirements around this, and it's one of the challenges. And that's both a technical and a governance problem. So we're involved in that from the point of view of identifying those requirements, and the fact that it's actually been boiled down to a very simple template really does make it at least clear. It doesn't necessarily make it easy.
Okay.
And one last thing, it's usually more complicated.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we should move on to the next
Yes.
presentation.